suchen. Da brauche ich ist auch gut dokumentiert. Kennst du bestimmt auch so, als Francisco da zum Beispiel, die haben alles gesehen. Ja.
So, I think we should proceed with our third,
Fourth. I know.
With our fourth lecture
Yeah, okay.
of Cynthia Hahn. We will now go to the treasures in a more large sense, but before we start, I will just welcome officially our big hero, Hans Berting, who is our last guest who joined us here. So welcome, Hans. We are happy to have you here. We will get this afternoon to Hans' first speech about iconic presence through the deserts. So I think we could start and
Okay. So, as we were talking about last time, we have to realize that Conques today no longer represents its powerful medieval presence that it once was. It has changed now from an essential stop for travelers from Rome to Europe to a powerful ecclesiastical force, now to a charming spot for tourism and with a local and friendly populace, and of course sometimes with intense students who arrive to study it. But that's the exception, as you well know. I cannot say it is because its treasures, this is all because its treasures are now owned by the state, but this might be one factor. That since 1895, the treasury is no longer the possession of the church. But the decline of the treasury does track the town's fortunes. The stories of treasuries make it seem as if treasures are acquired randomly. And I've already said this to you, but I want to emphasize it again. We should know better. In the case of Conques, given the spectacular sacred theft that really is the foundation of its greatest power, gifts and acquisitions are essential to the building of a treasury. Another myth that one often gets in thinking about treasuries is that the treasuries are a source of wealth to be drawn upon in times of trouble. I call that a myth because people seem to think that treasuries are completely flexible. Oh, we need some money, we melt down the treasures, we remake them. And that is simply not true. If it were true, there would be no treasure here. King's treasures no longer survive because that's the way they were treated. If you look consistently, the great treasures of kings, unless they were given to a church, have disappeared. But the churches try very hard to hold on to what is most important to them. And so when we look at the treasury, we can think through what's been melted down, what has been saved, and therefore what is dearest to the heart of the church here. We have, of course, looked at pieces from the treasury at length. As I argued, Foix is a treasury in herself, showing a history of gifts and devotions on her body. But one piece that has been removed in restoration tells us something else, and that is, you recall that there was once a spectacular altar frontal here, made of gold, mentioned by Bernard. And when we think about what happened to it, we get a case that is very representative. The monastery eventually took this apart. Now, first, it could have felt that it was too showy, too spectacular. Maybe that's not the case. Number two, it might have been too much a draw for theft. Maybe they just felt they couldn't protect it, so they removed it and used it for other things. Or three, that third possibility that I just negated, they may have needed the value of the gold for some particular financial situation, and therefore it was melted down. So there are various possibilities, but it's interesting that they did save part of it. They were not able to completely melt it down. They had to save some, and then they put it on Foix, which was later removed, and now it's in the treasury as a separate piece. So this is one, yes?
I have just an hypothesis about it, because we learned history from the monks about the importance destructions of the Presbyterian zone during the Reformation.
Mhm.
The Huguenots make a big fire into the
Yes, I know. I'm going to get to that. Yvonne,
Right.
please.
It was like,
Oh, so this was burned in the fire? Oh, okay.
That's the reason why maybe part survived. But
Oh, yeah, okay. That's interesting. So that was actually destroyed. Okay. Then I wonder how they managed to get it back. So when we look at the treasury today, we have to understand that there's been hard times and, again, how remarkable it is that so much has survived. So we must credit the townspeople. The monastery fell from its 12th to 13th century glory from a still healthy 50 monks in 1424. There were only 29 monks, from still healthy monks in the 14th century. By 1424, there were only 29. So the number kept going down and down. The monastery was secularized in 1537 and more or less looted at that point. See now, and set to torch, which seems to have happened to all the churches in this region. They seem to have built bonfires everywhere they went. But what I wonder is, how did they save any pieces of the altar frontal under those circumstances? That must have been a real act of heroism. And interesting to know. The monks themselves, when the monastery was secularized, the monks moved to St. Thomas Becket, a nearby church, and became instead canons. But the treasure that was able to survive at that point was hidden by the townspeople. And that's not the first time the townspeople really worked hard to save their treasury. That seems to be a consistent story that happens over and over again here in Conques. So we have to really think of the people of Sainte-Foy as the ones that have saved their treasury. It might help that we have this unique geography here. When the bad guys are coming up the hill, you have lots of warning. I don't know, they're struggling up the hill in their full armor, and you're, hiding things, I guess. It might, but I don't know. Later on, the cars are going to get you. At any rate, let's think about some of the status of the town as we move through time. In 1771, we have one very interesting document. Priests from the area were asked to survey their diocese to say what was going on in this area, and a local priest reports, quote, "There is no trade because of the lack of suitable roads. But 2/3 of the family spend most of their days without any bread. There are about 84 disabled people, counting many children, and 100 beggars in the parish." The priest finished this sad picture by saying, "Today, suffering from hunger, living from chestnuts, selling one's land and working for someone else. This is how we live. Here stands the situation." It sounds like the lowest possible point, but if you count up all those disabled and beggars, you still have a higher population probably than you do today. So it's an interesting picture of Conques in its perhaps lowest point. During one of the most serious crises for the treasury was that during the Revolution, a decree from the National Constituent Assembly suppressed the religious orders. Of course, Conques was already secularized at that point, and closed the monasteries and dispersed canons. So even the canons that were still living and thinking about foi were to be dispersed. But the last abbot at the head of the chapter, François-René d'Adamar de Panat, former almoner of the princesses Henriette and Adelaide, daughters of Louis XV, had to retire. And at that moment, in February 1792, an agent of the revolution arrived to carry out an inventory of the property of the chapter and church. And instead of that being a success, the women of the town came out beating drums and apparently making a tremendous ruckus, and a compromise was reached. It was felt that they just couldn't really take the treasure because of all this local disruption, and instead they made a kind of an agreement to hand over some silver. A big portion of silver, presumably some that they had off to the side, or maybe they actually handed over some reliquaries, but they kept the relics and the silver cross, the silver processional cross that's still in the treasury. 2 years later, though, the National Convention ordered the confiscation of all precious metal objects to be melted down. And in this time, they took advantage again of being up high on the hill and a distance from the administrative centers, ignored the orders, and hid everything. So into every possible cubbyhole. When they came to look, they didn't find it. It is said that one stormy night, a group of locals, led by the ecclesiastics, broke down the door of the church and the relic cabinet in order to pretend that a robbery had occurred. And then they said that, I'm sorry, it's not here. And this, I guess, fooled the revolutionaries enough that Conques becomes one of the rare exceptions where the treasury survives after the revolution. If you're somebody like me and you're looking for treasuries to study in France, it's a disappointment, always, one after the other, because of the work of the revolutionaries. But Conques is the exception because of these fierce town people. It's quite remarkable. After the revolutionary fervor died down and things seemed to be safe, the treasures were taken from their quote-unquote rustic hiding places, chimneys, sheds, gardens, etc., and restored to place in the treasury. So that's another testimony to the townspeople, because they did not try and keep them or ferret them away. Maybe they remembered that miracle that we talked about the other day, where the man discovered that bit of gold and was tortured by Foix until he turned it in. So they're all very responsibly turned the treasury back into the church. At that point, the town had about 700 people. So it's more than twice as big as it is now. Finally, there was one more big threat during World War II. The German Count von Metternich came here as part of Hitler's forces to investigate the treasury. But apparently, as an enlightened man, he was able to deceive the German authorities and said that the treasury was so deteriorated that it was not worth bothering about. So once again, Conques' treasury was saved. Or maybe he really thought it was so deteriorated that it was not. If so, he was wrong, at any rate. So the interesting thing is that also the building itself, as we well know, was not in the beautiful condition that it's today. Here's that picture that I showed you earlier, so we get some sense of what the building was like well before the revolution. But as this period passed, these periods of downturn for Conques, it was actually used as a quarry for the townspeople. And I know I pointed out to Adrian and a few others, there is one little house, you're gonna have to look for it as you go down. There's possibly a gallery column that's used there as a support for the post and for the porch. And there's some parts of the grates from the choir that are used on the windows. So clearly, you could ransack the church and use it for your own building materials.
Yeah, there's just a small comment from Hans about the person, the German officer who I been called. Can you tell us?
Well, he was director of the Herziana after the war.
I'm sorry?
He was director of the Bibliotheca Herziana in Rome after the war.
The same person.
Oh, so he was really sympathetic. Yes, I guess so. An art historian, in fact. So he knew well the worth of Conques, and he just deceived. And that's great. So, Prosper Mérimée, as we heard over and over again, the Inspector General of Historical Monuments, visited in 1837. He didn't think much of Foix. He seemed to think it was inferior and that it dated to the 11th century. Well, you know how hard it is to date. We've already talked about that. But nonetheless, he thought it rather late, and he thought the head was even later. So presumably he looked at the naturalism of the head and believed it was, a Renaissance or something like that. So he didn't really understand the quality of the statue, but of course he loved the building, so he ordered that it be restored. In 1873, a new clerical community was ordered, and liturgical practice was restored. At that point, they discovered what seems to have been a 16th century coffer holding relics that were in the ruins. It makes it sound as if they dug it up and, sort of excavations. I haven't found any more detail on that or which coffer that is. I'm sure it's one of the ones in the treasury. Maybe the monks can tell us which one that is. I'm a little confused about all the different boxes that Foix has wound up residing in. As we were trying to clarify yesterday, I think some of you asked, only the skull was in the image of Sainte Foy, the Majesté, and the rest of her bones were somewhere else in a coffer. And that's the coffer I'm not sure of. Sometimes it seems to be referred to tiny ones, and then you think, well, they couldn't possibly have the bones, or maybe it's I don't know. It'd be good to ask that question because the literature doesn't make it clear to me at any rate. Now we have one that's marked in the treasury as the most recent, but what the history of the various containers after that very clean sack, I'm not sure. At any rate, so as you know now, we have a group of Premonstratensians, or following St. Norbert, that are charged with the spirituality and maintaining the spirituality of Sainte Foy, but it is in this sort of strange status rather than the monastery that it was during the Middle Ages. In 1905, the treasury became the property of the state, and in 1911, the first treasury display, or sacrarium, was built. I'm not sure it was public access yet. And only the treasury was restored by Tarallon, Jean Tarallon, in the 40s. We've talked about that in terms of the intervention with Sainte Foy. There have been some more recent renovations of the treasury, and of course the presentation has been completely done after, in 2003. So there have been successive changes to that. I have to say, did I tell you the story of first coming here to the treasury? I can't remember. No? When I first came, before that period, before it was redone, it was a much more intimate space. Foy was right in the center, and when you came in the door, you were immediately confronted with Foy. And that was really wonderful because she was really quite stunning. I had a little daughter at that time. She was about 5. And when she came in the door, she went, because of Foy, which is certainly not what you do today in the treasury. She's almost, you have to scan around to look for her. She's off in a corner almost. So I, in a way that it seemed much more like a medieval presentation, the way it used to be, but it is much more thorough today. There are things that they pulled out and put on display that were certainly not at all apparent in the old installation of the treasury. So we have pieces of wax, we have the seals, we have that, all kinds of things that are very interesting to address the history of the monastery. Of course, I'm only talking just now about Conques itself. Yesterday we also addressed the idea that Conques had tremendous external influence in the wider ecclesiastical world. And indeed, here is a picture from Westminster with an image of Foy. She has a chapel there in England. There are numerous places and churches. Her fame spreads to Italy, Spain, South America. 23 English churches were consecrated to her. And here, St. Paul's Cathedral contains the St. Faith Chapel, also Westminster Abbey. She's so popular in popular culture that there's even been a kind of a novel / memoir written about her called Little Saint. I don't know if you've heard this. Someone who came and lived in Conques for quite a long. She says, she goes into rhapsody, the author, Hannah Green. My head sets off in longing, ready for this pilgrimage, the sense of hundreds of years, thousands of pilgrims, footsteps and miles of lands, of mountains, of rivers, all with an object, the golden statue, and in it the bones of that young girl who perished centuries before, who perished for her faith, for her pure courage. Isn't that a lovely sentiment? She's... that's the sort of thing you should imagine, I suppose, that most of the pilgrims are thinking. We know it's a little more complicated than that. And I want today to revisit the treasury to see the things that do not, aren't included within that more organized moment that we talked about for the 11th and 12th century yesterday. So far as I can determine, there is no medieval inventory for Conques. I haven't been able to find any notation of it. No one seems to mention one, which is odd. There is an inventory that was made by the Bishop of Rodez at a late moment, but no internal one so far as I know. So one has to rely on the cartulary to try and track any gifts. And those really, in terms of the cartulary, peak around the year 1000. That can't represent the complete story because we know that the treasury continued to grow after that period. We also have to consider recycling, which we've talked about a great deal. But what remains and what we can look at today still in the new installation of the treasury is very suggestive. Beata Frick, in her book Fallen Idols, suggests that treasuries such as, and she uses Conques specifically as an example, are not an assemblage of many saints. She's specifically countering me there, so I have to argue back, because I feel that when we look at a conque, I mean, visually, yes, foi dominates. There is no question. In this treasury, foi is the queen. She superbly dominates the whole thing. But, and she becomes a kind of, as we've called her, a treasury in herself, accumulating everything unto herself like a great magnet. But even if she steals our admiration and sums up the power of this church, there are very, very many other saints involved in these various reliquaries. The inscriptions say, and it contains the relics of many saints. And even if you look today, you see there are head reliquaries and there are other reliquaries such as the arm reliquary that refer to other saints. So we can't imagine that foi stands alone without the support of sort of the heavenly chorus, so to speak, which is, I think, essential to all treasuries. There's a 1516 visit from François d'Estaing that preserves a procès-verbal on the state of the monastery and describes a secondary altar within the choir. The 1568 fire produced modifications, and that's described as being an ancient altar with white marble. I wonder if that's the one that's now been moved to the center. And in the center of this is a reticule and an armoire with the 13 most important reliquaries. I would assume that's the wooden piece that's inside the door of the treasury. Have you all looked at that? When you first step inside, there's one with gilding and cherubs, right? You know, this large sort of wooden structure. And there is a large center arch there. Apparently, at the center of the reticule, foi was positioned, and then the other less important reliquaries around her. So there was some sort of, in the 16th century, there was some sort of display. Again, one would imagine that it's behind iron grills rather than being completely accessible to the faithful. When we think of treasury displays, I have that one picture. This is, of course, from the Dalmatian coast, or here's another way that a treasury might be represented. But I want to make it clear that there was an attempt to display treasuries to sort of make a public face of the wealth of the church, so that we have to imagine that Conques was not an exception to that, displaying as much as possible all of the wealth with, again, foi at the center. This particular one is Trier, and this is a broadsheet that represents the treasures of the Trier Cathedral, or some of them. And in that, we should imagine a sort of a vision of the city. And so similarly, Conques is sort of encapsulating and representing itself, just as the way I tried to argue that the reliquaries each represent some different aspect of the treasures of Conques. We know that the monastery was originally founded around a single hermit, Dado, and dedicated to the Savior. So not first dedicated to foi, remember that. She only came in the 9th century, right? So began as a dedication to the Savior. And we should remember that, again, in the 16th century and the 19th century, there was a great focus on this reliquary, the one that stymied us yesterday, in terms of exactly why it takes this shape. But if you look carefully at it, and when you see it in the treasury, it's even more clear, there is a very visible relic of the true cross on this treasury. That certainly has to do with why it was remade, so that in a later style reveals the relic of the true cross very, very clearly, and in fact almost becomes a sort of what's sometimes called a kiss target, a sort of a capsulation where you can approach the cross, even kiss it there. So in 1840, the bishops of Rosé and Saint-Flour visited Conques and observed the, yes, relic.
Just wondering about maybe the shape of the mountain, Golgotha.
Oh, that's fun.
Is the only thing that I think.
Where we're talking about the shape of this reliquary yesterday and mystified by it. Yes?
It looks really 19th century. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I think it is. No, this kind of presentation of the cross is quite a bit later. So one imagines perhaps that they had the crucifixion scene, they wanted to preserve that, so they come up with a rectangle for the bottom, yeah, and why not? A kind of a Golgotha, yeah, that would be very, that's 17th century and later, I would think, to come up with that conception, but why not? Sounds good. But what I'm saying is that we have these bishops that come to Conques in 1840, and their attention is on this relic, not on the foi. And this is their center of attention from the documents rise from that moment, which seems completely wrong to us, but is the true cross is the preferred relic always.
Do you have an explanation for me? Because, I mean, on one hand, I understand that you could be interested in the Holy Cross. On the other hand, I mean, I could not imagine a situation in which someone could go to see this reliquary and don't see the foi, except of...
Well, I'm sure they saw the foi. It's just that they don't note it, and that's not the intention for their visit. She doesn't like that comment, yeah. Maybe we should stop. Take a break. Oh, you just push the button. It says what? Oh, so you stopped it. So you stopped it. Okay, good. All right, well.
Can you wait 1 minute just to notice?
I'm waiting. What?
We can continue. It's like
Oh, okay.
literature.
So, Ivan, you just asked a question. You said you found it. How can one imagine that this would be the center of attention? But you do have to take into account that as we move into the later Middle Ages, the more universal saints, the more universal elements, relics, are the ones that are celebrated most. So you have Virgin Mary and the instruments of Passion really come into prominence and pushing away the local saints.
Because I was thinking of two maybe possible explanation. One is that we don't, often in half 19th century when they were visiting relics, they were searching for authentica.
Oh,
the
that's
relics
true.
which were not authentic were like just not considered at all. And so often they were just like destroyed, as well as some ex voto at the time. So I was wondering if there is an authentica inside of Saint Foy or not. And if there is not, for 19th century positivist thinking, it's not a relic anymore.
Well, yes, but they weren't opening it at that point. That's
So
the interesting thing.
maybe-
So yeah, they probably thought she was, again, an idol, right? Just like Bernard.
Yeah.
And her story is very short, and the people, the Bollandists, in studying the stories of saints, I think were very suspicious of those very short, what looked like late accounts of martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
So they may have been not wanting to disturb the populace of Conques, which are obviously so loyal, but but being a little bit doubtful about her origin. So, that's probably the explanation, yeah.
Which is quite, and from an art historical point of view, it was just,
I know, they don't have our opinions.
no, but it
Yeah.
was like industrial art is not interesting, and it's ugly since it's medieval, so no reason to just take care about it.
Well, I mean, they may have looked at her and they may have admired her, but their purpose was to come and look at this particular relic and inventory it. Yeah, so I think your explanation is probably right. Counting up all the pieces of the true cross, so that they could try and reconstruct it, that occurred at that point. So. Yeah. At any rate, so, but my point is that even if we look at the reliquaries, we don't see the presence of other saints. They certainly were there, and they were conscious of them. They were carried in procession with Bois, although again, this is a modern procession, so we don't see they don't carry the other reliquaries anymore, but they did in the Middle Ages. So, so she had her support of all of the other saints around her. One of the reliquaries we haven't discussed this far is the arm. And of course, I've worked on arms before. You may know me as the arm reliquary lady. So, we ought to really turn around and discuss that. It is dated later than the period of Begon. That's why we didn't do it yesterday. But at this point, by the 13th, possibly 14th, possibly 15th century, again, very difficult to date, every treasury ought to have an arm reliquary. Why is that? Because these are objects that really become essential to liturgical practice at this point. Arm reliquaries, as I have argued elsewhere, are not what might be called speaking reliquaries, that is, display units that tell us what's inside of them. In other words, this is not an arm shape because it has an arm inside of it. It may have an arm inside of it, but the bigger point is that they are flexible objects that carry multiple meanings and have very, very clear-cut liturgical uses. The example of Conques is said to be a reliquary of George. And when I first saw that, I immediately assumed, as probably all of you are doing, that it's the soldier Saint George. But in fact, that's not true. The 17th century inventory by the Bishop of Rodez clarifies that this is the Brachium Destrum Sancti Georgi Confessoris. So this is George a confessor. So this is probably a monk of Conques who became, again, Conques' amazing influence, a Bishop of Lodève in 877. So in the 9th century, a monk of Conques went out to become a bishop elsewhere, and this may be him, or at least that seems to be the identification in the inventory in the 17th century. As such, if it is a bishop, it becomes a wonderful support, part of the supporting cast for Conques, because as a bishop, she's a female martyr, he becomes a male bishop, and we get that kind of relationship that's just so common of a sort of a female actor in the medieval church that is supported by a male confessor that sort of interprets her actions or makes it present for the church. So kind of a nice pairing at that rate. We know that liturgical arms were used in liturgies to bless congregations and were carried in processions. They were even used to effect healings. This is an example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I'm very fond of because, as you can see there, of course, there's a wooden core, silver sheath, but there, in particular, if you look at the fingers, the silver is actually worn off on the tips of the fingers or broken. And one imagines that this arm had very vigorous usage in healings, in ceremonies. And this is an instance where a reliquary does really touch people with the appropriate part, that is the fingers. So this is something that really reaches out quite literally, and that's the great fondness for the arm shape. And think in contrast again to the reliquary of Foix, which probably really wasn't touched, except for by very privileged persons. So again, it makes a nice pairing. Arm reliquaries became very important in the 11th and 12th century, not least because of the importance of the right arm in the conception of the body, but also because in the hierarchy of the church, saints are known as the arms or the limbs of the church, the active members of the church, the beings on earth who carry out the wishes of Christ, who is characterized as the head in heaven. So that this becomes a visualization of the possibilities of the church. This is very much grounded in biblical texts, multiple points in the New Testament that characterization occurs, but Christ as the head and saints as the arms, but in particular in the in the 2 Corinthians. Two other elements of note about this particular reliquary, this one. I've just identified it as George. That's the one that is comfortable at this point, but at one point it was also identified as Vincent, so we're not entirely sure about this arm reliquary, and this is not very unusual. This happens all the time with treasury objects. Heads are even misidentified as other people, so let's not be too secure about who it is. And he was a deacon, so again, a companion. Actually, he was one of the companions in Aachen, so he would be also an appropriate male companion to Foy. Also, I want to note that the cuff has clearly been remade, and possibly as late as the 15th century. We've seen again and again that the reliquaries are remade in Conques, so this may be the bane of art historians, but really becomes an interesting factor to look at. Actually, if we want to discuss at this point, it might be interesting. One of the things that I like to see in these arms, and you can see it in this one as well from the Met, is that arms change as they're displayed, in effect. When you're carrying this thing, you might hold it out like this, or you might even put it horizontal. And it's wonderful the way that the fabric often is flexible in that way. They drape it as if it could be either in this position or in this position, if you look at the way the drapery is done. Now, on the back side of this arm, and I'm sorry I didn't put that photograph in, it's really very plain. But then on the front, we see a series of gems. Well, in this case, this arm was redone as well. And these gems are later additions. This cuff also is a later restoration or change, possibly also from the 15th century. So this arm as well has 2 dates. Now, interestingly enough, it was displayed in the Met with a single date until quite recently, and now suddenly they've put in 2. I know the audience doesn't like to have 2 dates, but you just have to deal with that. Reliquaries were remade. So when we look at George, let's call him George for now, maybe he's Vincent, we also see that same kind of approach. Maybe this was a weak point in reliquaries, because this cuff is, again, clearly redone, and once again, as a standing unit that is possibly displayed more permanently, they, again, focus on the front, and I would think that this is a later addition, although perhaps not. It's integral to the silver, but it's possible that, it was reworked at some point to match this reworking, which is clearly a later addition. The hands had to be repaired as well, so that probably was the fingers had to be. It was probably showed a lot of wear, just like the one I just showed you. I wonder about this little door and whether that was access then. This sort of filigree is very typical. In fact, that's the most typical sign of the metalwork of Conques. I was looking back at the most comprehensive study, which is only about 30 pages long, of the metalwork at Conques, and he focuses on garland. He focuses on the filigree and the places that it occurs. And really, if you look at all the different reliquaries of Conques, filigree almost always impinges somewhere. There's a little piece of it, and he has diagrams of where it occurs in every one of the reliquaries, but it's very dispersed. So that may be the effects of 15th century restorations or possibly even later ones. Anyone want to say anything about the arm that they notice or jump in? No, okay. These are the 2 possibly most mucked up ones in the whole treasury. One almost thinks these were made out of scraps that were around. I don't even know what to think of it. They're very, very odd shapes, and they call them the hexagonal and the pentagonal reliquaries. What do you do with that? I really don't know. I mean, the range of motifs on these are just so broad that they couldn't possibly have been manufactured or made. I mean, in a certain period, they're clearly a sort of assemblage of different parts. Who knows what they started with. Anyway, but let's look at them. So the hexagonal reliquary. The most obvious and exciting part here is the fibula of the 7th century, approximately dated, which is has some wonderful cloisonné and garnet work here, which is very comparable to the cross of Saint-Éloi that was at one point presiding over the altar of Saint-Denis. I also compare it once again to the Andreas altar in Trier. So we get that affection for the sort of presentation of medallions at the center of these early reliquaries. So there may be a core here that is, let me go back, that is quite, that represents an earlier moment. But then when we look at these two settings, these are late Gothic settings. So what this really was at any point, it's very hard to say. Even this probably represents later medieval settings. So although this may be, and this gem may be an early moment, just about nothing else here really looks early. Yeah? This second, yeah? Yeah, yes, there are quite a few of those pieces here, another one on the other side. And yeah, well, those three bits seem very much like an early piece. So how do we reconstruct that? What is that from? That's really, I mean, I'm not even, maybe a smaller box reliquary of some kind, but then once we get to this insertion of these crystal openings, that's the influence of a much later aesthetic for reliquaries. And in fact, this is probably one of the most impressive parts of this reliquary, because we say that authentic says, and can we read it? From this, I assumed I'd be able to read it, but it's of course invisible. Anyway, it says multarum sanctarum down here. So multiple saints are in here, and this is certainly a medieval authentic. I'm not sure how to date that. What did you think, Sybil? 12th century inscription, but so probably earlier than the 15th century or 16th century, when we think maybe this was assembled. So one imagines a situation where they were forced to give up pieces of silver, to melt down reliquaries, but they saved the scraps that seemed the most significant in that sort of spolia operation we talked about last time. And then they've saved all the relics very carefully, and they've reassembled it here, maybe combining 3 or more reliquaries into one, or something to that effect. It's interesting, yeah?
Just a point, for me it was interesting, the pentagonal, let's say, construction, because even if it's completely different, there seems to be a memory of those bourse of
Yes.
7th century.
No, I agree completely. When I first saw this, that was what I tried to make it into, a bourse reliquary. Yes. But
so we could really imagine that it was a really old piece with this kind of construction, and that the latest restoration tries to maintain
the general shape, yeah. No, I think that's a very reasonable speculation, that they had some kind of bourse reliquary, and they've expanded it slightly, reused the imagery, reused the materials, and then
because we have, for example, what cloisonné, but Emmanuel cloisonné on the Alteus reliquary, which is dated end 8th century, the one small bursa from the valley in Sion. Very ugly one, but still with nice pieces of cloisonné on the front, and on the back there is metalwork and silver. So,
no, I agree, and there's I think a very much a consciousness of bourse reliquaries, of purse reliquaries in treasuries. It's one of the pieces that everyone seems to think they ought to have a purse reliquary, even if they don't, because maybe they were recognized as very ancient, so that sometimes you see them made, and there's a 12th century one. Where is that from? It's from the Netherlands somewhere. It was in the Way to Heaven exhibition, and that's far. The era of purse reliquaries was 6th, 7th, 8th century possibly. There's of course the Carolingian one in the treasury at Vienna, the St. Stephen's Borsa. So up to the Carolingian period. Then after that they really fell away. And yet they're treasured, they're not changed, they're kept, and I think they're they're recognized as very antique and valuable for that reason. So then you get this 12th century one, that they make a new one in the 12th century. So that might have been the impetus here, or maybe they had, there's so many speculations. I mean, the Pippin reliquary, we said, is really a kind of a purse reliquary. So they have one, but maybe, I don't know. It's hard to even guess, but yeah, my first instinct when I saw it was, it's a purse reliquary, but it's too big. It has no clasps on the side to carry it. So it's just a sort of ancient memory of a purse reliquary. And then what do you do with this one? This is the pentagonal reliquary. Yes, the hexagonal is the pentagonal reliquary. Again, not exactly a pentagon, but it does have 5 sides. So, also called or described as being a monstrance. In other words, a reliquary that's meant to show the relics inside. If so, it's failing because we can't see anything inside of it except for some vague bits of red cloth. So it's not clearly displaying its relics, but it does have these openings. I think more spectacular really is the metalwork, for example, on this piece in the very center of it. A really beautiful quadrilobe with filigree work. But this close-up also shows you how scattershot the whole assemblage is. It's really just pieces of clipped silver assembled together and gems attached to random bits, so that here you can clearly see that that's a bit of filigree, but it's cut off in the middle and then put together with this piece attached to there, and these are all separate pieces that are just assembled together. It still makes a nice effect. It has a lot of gems that are quite beautiful, and even an ancient cameo, although that may actually not be ancient, but rather something like a 12th century cameo, which is interesting too. So I'm not even sure what this is, what that piece of material is, but it seems to be preserved at the very center of this, which is quite interesting. There's another view of it. Again, it a little bit is reminiscent of that's the hexagonal, and from the side you can see it does look a little bit like a purse. But no attachments, so you couldn't carry it in any way.
Because for the pentagonal, it's also an interesting thing. In the larger view, you really see the way in which gems are put on, and once more, it reminds Stefan Borsa or the collection of Monza in a very, let's say, abstract way. But what touched me when I saw it the first time, it was having the same feeling like you had, something like, that's completely remade 50 times, but there is a memory, and even doing this, I don't know which step of remaking, they wanted to maintain the tradition. So it's like we are having here old steps. Look on those reliquaries, they will remind you the stars of the oldest, between the oldest one.
Yeah.
So, like, really insist on the age, because, it's so paradoxical, but so close in a certain sense.
Well, there's a real feeling for that the incrustation of gems is going to be the aesthetic they want to put forward the most. So, since gems couldn't be melted down, maybe they made a policy of always keeping them, and then they've just added more and more. It does have a pretty effect from a distance, especially because of this framing of gems. So I think for non-art historians, it's a perfectly fine reliquary. It's when we start to examine it, we're a little dismayed. So we're really thinking that it has, 12th, 14th, 16th century alterations, maybe 19th century alterations. Again, it's a little awkward in terms of the way it's assembled, but stepping back, it is, it's a satisfactory thing. Probably the best conclusion is that these are 16th century assemblages from things that were cut up. Yeah? What?
I just
Yes.
wanted to ask about the back side and the lateral sides. Is it the 3D object, or do we have just fronts of the restorations?
I have never seen a photograph of the back.
And they're not like...
That would be a really interesting thing to see because, how much does it...
How they were conceived, like the
Yeah,
object?
yeah. Well, I think we can see here that the side is plain.
Yeah,
So
but it's plain.
maybe the back is too. These are not one of the ones you can push the button and turn around. Yeah. Well, and since they have this, it's a good observation because they also, since they have no handles or loops, there's no loop on the top. This wasn't displayed in 3 dimensions probably. Maybe it just sat on an altar. So then one would imagine also you could go further than that, say it's probably never carried in procession. So it becomes a static object for frontal display, which is completely antithetical to the way that the earlier reliquaries existed.
Can they be somehow created out of the so big amount of what the offerings they were just accumulated in the place, and they decided to make...
You think it might be offerings that keep accumulating, or that they had? That could explain the gems, surely. That would come in. Yeah, sure. I mean that could be possible instead of thinking of breaking down reliquaries and remaking them. But as I go on, I'm going to talk a lot about recycling, so that'll give a different picture maybe of they're not so intent to preserve everything. So when I talk about a treasury being shaped, I mean it also involves letting some things go, as well as being very careful to preserve things. Yeah. What? Who? Yes. I just heard a voice, but didn't see the hand.
I just wanted to ask if it's possible that they are treated always like a couple, like 2 reliquaries, because these 2 cloisonnées over there and this one in the center, they are more or less the same. They look to me like the same work or something like that.
Yeah, I wish the projection were slightly better, but it's very actually different work.
No, but they are the Masaryk.
I'm sorry, what are we talking about?
The rectangular on the bottom. Yeah, if I may show it.
Yes, you may.
Like this
Yeah.
part.
Oh, yeah,
and
okay,
these
oh, yeah,
two.
yeah.
It looks very similar to me.
Yeah.
So if
No,
it's-
yes, of course, I'm sorry.
If it's possible that they were like treated together or remained together and always treated like a couple or have some connotations with each other. I don't know, just...
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I wish I had some photographs of treasury displays. To show you, I could go back to the ones we had, but they're not so clear. But they're often symmetrical. They'll have the primary reliquary in the center, which is usually the cross, but in this case it would be foi. And then reliquaries are placed on either side. So you have 2 arms, one on either side, or 2 crosses, one on the Basel treasury. There's a description of the treasury display, and someone has done a reconstruction of it, and it's very clear that there's a kind of a balance. So even very odd reliquaries are often paired with another odd reliquary on the other side. So yeah, I think that's right. They're probably a pair. And probably for, as we've been concluding, frontal display. So then we have to imagine it perhaps in that wooden unit that's inside. So we'll have to try and figure that out when we go to the treasury. What was in all those spots? Because those were the most prominent reliquaries in that display. And they surely, a flashy one like this, these are quite lovely with all the gems, would be perfect for that because you would see it from the other side of the grill, what, about 15 or 20 feet away. So foi in the center and these as accompaniments. Unfortunately, at that distance, you wouldn't be able to read that authentic, but the testimony is that there are all these other saints supporting her.
Should we make a break because we did already more than 1 hour, so we can make a short break?
Sure?
So let's do our 10 minutes of break, get a little air and we can proceed.
We're good. Okay, so we're back, and we were leaving last looking at some reliquaries that looked as if they might be early, especially because of the enamel work or the cloisonné work on there. But that's not enamel, that's garnet set in a cloisonné setting. But we've discovered that, in fact, these are quite late 16th century, so we're moving decisively into the 14th, 15th, 16th century of the treasury. One of the things that that turns up from this period is this silver Madonna. Of course, as you well know, the church also has a cult of the Virgin. We have this beautiful Romanesque sculpture that we were looking at last night as we were joining in the pilgrim prayers. And so this piece survives. It apparently was, the document about it is that it was restored by Abbot Raymond de Drayac. So it's unclear when it came into the treasury, other things about it. We could discuss it if you wish. I really don't know much about it. It's a lovely piece and it's prominent in the treasury today. We also know that this abbot, Raymond de Drayac, donated liturgical goods from purchases he made in Paris, which is an interesting diversion here now. We are starting to think that the things, that the metalwork that comes into Conques hereafter is not made in Conques. So it no longer seems to have a functioning workshop. And in fact, one of the missing pieces from the treasury thus far, from all the things that we've looked at, have been the more functional liturgical pieces. We had a portable altar, but other than that, we haven't really seen things that you would expect to see in almost every treasury. Bernard, in the Liber Miracolorum, mentions a fine silver cross. In fact, he even tells us that the silver was captured from a Saracen by Raymond II, the Count of Rouergue. So we have a history of that particular source of silver, which is interesting. Raymond II then donated the silver to Conques. But that cross doesn't exist anymore. Instead we have, I'm sorry, this is a drawing instead of a photograph, but we have this beautiful and large 14th century processional cross that still is extant and is in the treasury today. We know that we have a good amount of documentation on this. We know the name of the maker, Pierre Frécheux, and we know that he was working in Villefranche-de-Rouergue, so not in Conques at all. And Villefranche seems to have been a place where an established metalworking tradition was continuing into the Renaissance, and Conques goes there. There's a few things that seem to come from there. So this beautiful piece gets produced. I know not very much about its details, except to say that it does have a relic of the cross in it, so it is truly a cross reliquary, but that was not deposited until 1879 by the Premonstratensians. So it's a really late addition. So I don't know if that little door-like presentation, maybe you can see it better in this slide, is the repository for the cross or not. I think that when we go to the treasury, maybe we should look carefully at that whole lower portion, which is really quite beautiful with the little figures attached to it. Sort of out of my area of expertise, we're really talking about a later 14th century, and one would imagine even later ramifications on this particular cross. Here we see it in procession, carried before, in front of foi, of course, always in procession. In the 14th century, a number of other objects, I said liturgical objects of undetermined specificity were added to the treasury. They seem to have gone again already. But we also have a set of smaller reliquaries that are more typical of the 14th century that exist still in the treasury. And they could make good use of rock crystal. And these are really the monstrance reliquaries that become very popular at this point. You can really fully look into them. Again, not necessarily seeing clearly the relic, but still you can look into them. And they usually have church-like shapes. They're pretty common shapes, this little set of 3. Possibly more interesting, I think, is this figure. Did you see her when you were in there? She's relatively small, but she's quite lovely. And she is made out of gilded silver. And who is she? What? Yeah, she's Foix. She's Foix again. So we have a secondary image of Foix. Seems peculiar to feel as if we need this, but again, it certainly follows trends in this period. For example, I just threw in a couple pictures that I found on my computer of silver figures like this. These are from Louvain. Leuven. Louvain. And I just happen to have them. So a whole set of these silver figures. They often come in groups, in multiples. These really lovely. In fact, the Church of Wittenberg had thousands of them practically. So silver figures were very, very common. At this moment, very popular. And instead of the Foix that we're used to, she's presented very, very differently, sort of shy, sort of not very assertive, not that imperial figure that we see Foix as regular. Again, a wooden core, silver on the outside. She has her attributes, which would be, you can see the grill. That was her first form of martyrdom, of torture. She didn't die from being grilled, so they're clearly remembering their story. And she didn't die on the grill. Instead, they found that she lived on in typical heroic splendor of a martyr, and she had to be beheaded with a sword, so she holds that as well. And then the third thing is a palm, which is a more generic attribute of a martyr. Now, this figure was made in Villefranche-de-Rouergue in 1493 to 7. A document exists that recounts that the monks and the abbot of the monastery, represented by the sacristan, Bernard de Mouilly, brought 6 marks of silver from damaged objects and asked that they make an image. So there's a very specific commission, and they're using this recycled silver from the monastery. More documents, however, show that they had to be very committed to this project because they had to supply yet more silver, seemingly a substantial quantity more of silver to finish the object. And so it takes much longer than it might have been expected, a 4-year project, while they wait to collect a little more silver and supply it. One scholar projects that it might have had a little tabernacle. Certainly it must have had a base or something, but it's not very clear how this figure was used or displayed or what its original presentation was. Here, these ones, as you can see, have bases, so one would imagine that she did as well. This is another later reliquary of the treasury that we hadn't looked at before. It's a type that begins in the 13th century, a kind of a tablet reliquary. In fact, the inspiration is perhaps a Byzantine type. I'm sorry.
It's invisible.
It just got taken. I was looking at it, and it just disappeared. One of those magic of the PowerPoint.
It's Malevich effect.
What?
Malevich effect.
The Malevich
Black
effect.
on black.
So you have to imagine a Byzantine reliquary with many different little portals into a relatively flat surface where you can view, so to speak, the relics. They are not super visible, they're tiny fragments, but in fact more visible are the little labels. So that one has a kind of approach to this reliquary of a set of prayers, almost like a litany, praying to this saint or that saint or this object or that object, going through a kind of a ritual prayer as you look at this display. This is a triptych, as you can see. That's a reconstruction after a deconstruction. It was once presented as a pair. The 2 doors were taken off and put together so that you had 2 pairs. And that's interesting in terms of 17th century display again. like we were talking about having things coming in pairs. Maybe that's why they did that. But from the evidence of the holes on the back, they have now reconstructed it as a triptych, which is certainly correct. So this could be closed or open to be presented more as an individual object of devotion. So that would be an interesting project to try and understand how this was used in its time period. There is an engraving from 1861 that shows it in the triptych form. And we know from that that it is really missing substantial portions. I think you can see in the lower left-hand side that a whole section is of elaboration. You can see the hole, but not the little frame for it. So it is in relatively bad condition. Let's see, that's the missing piece. That's another photograph of it, so you can see a little bit, maybe other parts. Are we going to get it here? Oh, there's a detail of the one I was going to show you. I don't know why it came back in that form. Really strange. And here's another, perhaps a little more close-up of the triptych reliquary, where you can see that each one has a little window, and you can peer into it, although I don't think any of the relics are still in it, and what you're seeing is cloth backing that is starting to fall apart. So, but it's interesting to see this because it's a very typical reliquary type, and we're starting to understand these later moments in the treasury is that we still have avid collectors, so to speak, of relics. The abbots seem to be reaching out to get things that are more current. I'm really fascinated by the fact that reliquaries sort of have styles, vogues. You know, one wants to have the latest in terms of a reliquary. You can look at that from the point of view of stimulating the congregation, stimulating the viewers. The old forms somehow seem too familiar, and so you come up with a new way of approaching and displaying reliquaries. Or you can just see it as fashions, whichever. But nonetheless, with all of these new accumulations, we see that the treasury is very much still living. It hasn't just ended in the 13th century. It's not just the standard pieces that are usually presented, changing and meeting new devotional trends throughout the Middle Ages. There's just a few more pieces that I want to mention that I don't have photographs of because I wasn't even aware of them until I saw the new installation of the treasury. There is not a good publication on the treasury of Conques. The one that exists is from the display at the Louvre, which was many years ago, and didn't get everything that is currently in the treasury. So when I saw it, I was amazed to see a cross that looked like this. This is not the picture. Did anyone see this one when you were in the treasury? Well, look for it now. This is a really significant relic as far as I can see from just a visual identification of it. These are two other examples. Maybe they don't look like much to you, but if it is what I think it is, and comparable to these two examples, these are reliquary crosses that come from Jerusalem. And they come from a very specific site in Jerusalem, the Jehoshaphat monastery outside the Holy Sepulchre. That monastery had a significant piece of the true cross, and during the Crusader dominance in Jerusalem, it systematically distributed these crosses across Europe. I mean, it didn't sell them. Again, we have those notions of exchange. In fact, I recently gave a paper on this casket, which is in Toulouse. Does anyone know this one? You've seen it? In Toulouse, now on display. I saw it on Friday when I stopped in Toulouse on my way here. Not very well displayed in Toulouse. It was much better in the Jerusalem show in New York. It's a very significant reliquary. It's a Limoges reliquary of the 13th century, and a very unusual Limoges reliquary of the 13th century that has narratives on it. We love reliquaries that tell us about themselves, but very few of them do. So this is a significant piece, and not only does it have a story on it, but there are many, many inscriptions on this piece. So it's kind of wonderful. At the top, you see the Three Marys at the Sepulchre. That's actually what I'm most interested in, but I'm not going to go there right now. Let's look at the side, where I've broken it down here into various pictures, and I had on a PowerPoint in my computer so I could just slot it in once I saw this other piece. But you see here that all these inscriptions detail the fact that the cross went from the very beginning of its existence, that is Helena discovering it in Jerusalem, then it was given to the monastery in Jerusalem, and Abbot Jean of Josaphat here in Jerusalem gives the cross to Raymond Botardelli, who is much more local to here where we are in France. He is known, his name is known from he's on a document from Toulouse. We only have his name occur once, but he is a known personage. He seems to have traveled to Jerusalem just for the express purpose of acquiring this cross, and there he is getting it handed over with lots of inscriptions, including, I can't see these. At any rate, I haven't written it out on there. This says Oremos, right here on this little scroll right there, Oremos. So as he receives it, we put that into a kind of a performative relationship where it immediately passes not only the relic, not only the object, which was probably made in Jerusalem, by a group of Western metal workers that we know were working in Jerusalem for these kinds of interests. And it passes right over to him, and it becomes an object of celebration, of liturgical celebration. Anyway, Raymond steps right onto the ship and leaves Jerusalem, and immediately comes back to Toulouse. And in Toulouse, he hands the cross over to Abbot Pons of Toulouse, and Hic dat Abbati Pontio. Anyway, but then we get a different picture on the other side of the reliquary, and that would be this side. No, I'm sorry, that's the first part of the ceremony. The other side shows Christ in Majesty above, but below in the narrative we see the cross arriving in Toulouse, and three canons, first Raymond, then where is Raymond? I can't see this. I need to look here. At any rate, yes, Raymond has passed them, but the three canons, what we have is here is an Adventist scene. So there's Toulouse. The three canons are coming out of the church. They're all holding liturgical objects. Raymond has passed them by, sort of in simultaneous narrative. And Raymond is kneeling here and passing the cross now again to Abbot Pons. So we have it once as immediate, but then a second time as a ceremonial occasion as the relic comes into town. Just recalling yesterday when we were talking about, or was it the day before? The day before, when we were talking about foi arriving and the monks coming out to greet her. That is the proper way to receive a relic. It should be done with the ceremony of Adventus, which is originally a Roman imperial ceremony but gets customized for the reception of relics by the early Middle Ages already. At any rate, so we see here a very clear representation of that ceremony. He passes over the cross, and then as a sort of a parallel here, Jerusalem, there Toulouse, this closed and this one open. You see the portals are open to receive this great gift from the city of Jerusalem. I want to just point out one detail of this before we go back and look at the others. Do you see that cross is quite distinctive? It has two cross pieces, and that is occurs elsewhere, but is very distinctive of the Jerusalem crosses. Now, the other thing that I want you to look at when you look in the treasury and see what I think is a Jerusalem cross is it's relatively small. These are all not so big, and that corresponds. There is an opening here behind which is the wood. So it's accessible. You can't really touch it. It's recessed enough, but it's visible, very visible. And then there are these little holes, openings, often done as quadrifoils. Sometimes these are gemmed, but often quite plain, because they're very precious just because of their contents. And these little openings and quadrifoils represent stones. They have stones set into them from different locations in Jerusalem, so that this cross becomes a simulacrum of pilgrimage. As you look at it and pray in front of it, you can touch the stones that represent Golgotha, that represent Mount Zion, that represent the the Church of the Nativity, etc., and make a progress around Jerusalem. These things were wonderful for people who actually came to Jerusalem, but perhaps even better for those who could not, because they become a spiritual, an object that can be used to recreate a spiritual pilgrimage. And there was, in fact, there's some wonderful research being done on this, on confraternities that own these objects. So that Toulouse is one part of a large network of monasteries across Europe that become confraternities of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's probably the distribution network. We don't have lots of documents on exactly how these were given and paid for, what exchange was made, probably money to support the monastery in Jerusalem, but what other things were done. But there, we do have prayer books in which the different members of this confraternity are commemorated, and it stretches from Paris to Barcelona to Toulouse, all around Europe. It's really quite a fascinating network, and really a subject of research that's being done right now. So I want you to look at this, and I think it's really a significant piece, and I am surprised that I had no knowledge that it was here before I came. And of course my internet access is so terrible I couldn't even really quickly do research and see if it's known that, it must be known that it's here in Conques by the people who study reliquaries of the True Cross. But if it's one of these, I think it's a very significant object. So at any rate, so we have that. I don't have pictures of the other things, but I love that there is a large chunk of possibly fatimid rock crystal, although just to nuance that, so to speak, there is going to be a very significant a conference on rock crystal taking place in Florence in May, of which I am the co-convener, and we're going to disrupt all the studies of rock crystal. Rock crystal is one of my favorite semi-precious gems from the Middle Ages. It's so wonderful. I've already mentioned it before, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow as well. But one young German scholar is saying that we all say they're all fatimid, all of these chip-cut rock crystal objects, but he thinks that they're from a much broader time period. So that's just a sort of, that's we Western medieval art historians making a shorthand identification. They're more complicated than that. But nonetheless, they are very valued in the Western medieval world. Typically, they really pass through the Ottonian court or some other means of exchange. They were high status value objects, and they wind up in treasuries very, very frequently because of that high value. The piece that's in the treasury here it looks like a canning jar. It's a little cylinder with a kind of a rough top on it. It must have once had a status in the middle of the monstrance reliquary or some other kind of usage, but it's really quite beautiful. So they've preserved it because it becomes one of those treasured objects that they're not willing to get rid of and have taken on a kind of a sacred nature, and so it's still in the treasury. There's an ivory box in the treasury. One of the things I found in my travels to see treasuries is that every treasury has an ivory box. Ivory boxes are very much valued, and they don't have to have imagery on them. They're not like the Brescia casket, the spectacular thing full of imagery. Many of them are completely plain. There's one that's an Ak, and that's gorgeous because it's so big, but it's almost completely aniconic. It seems to be the material itself that must be in a treasury. It has associations with flesh, associations with the Virgin, the whiteness, the purity, the tactile quality of ivory is so appealing. At any rate, it's quite remarkable. But I have to say there's probably a couple exceptions, but every time you go to a treasury, you find there's an ivory box. So I'm glad to see that Conques has its ivory box. It's quite small. But there's the veil of Sainte-Foy, that big piece of cloth, which is probably the main reason it's so dark in that treasury, because in order to display cloth continually, you really have to have low light levels. I couldn't even see. Does it have terraz on it? Did anybody look carefully? Do you know what I mean by terraz? It's a strip woven into the cloth. that's an Islamic identification, it usually says, the, the prayer and God and one God and Allah and so forth. But then it often gives a date and a caliphate or something like that. So if it's an Islamic piece, there's a stripe, but it's so dark in there I couldn't really see. So see if anybody can puzzle that out. If so, it's typical because many of the pieces of treasured cloth associated with saints in treasuries are Islamic manufacture. They were great textile makers. They made very fine textiles. They were exotic and therefore seemed to come from far away and long ago. And again, those sort of associations of general antiquity make them very valuable. I have a student who's working on the Veil of St. Anne, which is also one of the largest surviving early pieces of Islamic textile. So it's very common that the textiles that survive in San Servatius and in many of the treasuries around Europe are of Islamic manufacture. So that would make that pretty.
Just a small note, the workers know it already, but in the Santiago's way, there is close connection, of course, to Masaryk Spain, and we get the privilege to spend a bit of time with the doors of Le Pionville, which were probably constructed by someone coming out from this kind of culture, since the inscription is, of course, in Kufic characters and is written Allah Akbar of the main part of the door.
Right, of
And
course.
so the discussion, Katarina knows it better than I, is like about what kind of personage could be there to do it, but just that the Santiago's way is really a connection between words, also in this sense. I mean, not a very positive one, because Matamoros was it was attribution of Santiago to destroy the Islamic part of Spain still. We have really this close connection, and recently Christa proposed that the visual aspect of the Mojave culture through the Santiago's way went until Cluny, so he was arguing for the opposite way, that the chromatic question, for example, the use of lapis lazuli with gold, which is so visible now on the Porta la Gloria, was in fact a visual imprinting of the Islam. I don't know that if Christ is a bit crazy, but still.
Well, lapis lazuli and gold is blue and gold are possibly the most popular colors in all of them. But yeah, I mean, I think that, not to downplay that, I think it's there's tremendous back and forth, and the textiles really show that. I would be really curious to know when it entered the treasury and how it was used, because it's surely not a piece that was displayed. It wrapped something, it was inside of something, surely, or it was, there's no evidence that it was originally in a reliquary and displayed, so where did they find it and when did it come in? Those would all make really big differences. If it came in very long ago, I don't know. It's probably misunderstood. I mean, I doubt I'm just saying maybe it's Islamic, because as I said, I can't even see whether there are Islamic characters on there. Well, we should all study that when we get in and see if anybody has sharper eyes and can see that in the dark. But if it is Islamic, they probably didn't know it was Islamic. It's interesting that they should have a large piece of fabric and they should call it the veil. We've seen her veiled and unveiled, haven't we? On the cult statue, she's not veiled, but on the tympanum, she's veiled, and elsewhere the veil is mentioned. Bernard mentions the veil. So it seems a proper thing for a virgin martyr, I guess. So let's have one, I guess. Where we have this large piece of fabric, let's call it the veil of Saint Foy. Anyway, so that's another really interesting part of the treasury. Of course, there's the gospel treasury book. A gospel book in a treasury binding. We suggested yesterday that the foi, portable altar, may have been a frame for a gospel, reused and made into a portable altar identified with foi herself. But they would always want to have a treasury binding. That's used in processions when the beginning of the liturgy begins and the entry into the church by the clergy on large feast days. That's carried in. It represents, in some sense, the presence or entry of Christ into the sacred space of the church. So a treasury binding is a very important part of ceremonies and of processions. And a church as prosperous as Conques that had a golden altar frontal would certainly have had a treasury binding too. Today that one is quite late, what is it, 16th or 17th century, I'm not sure. And then totally missing from the treasury, and I already said it, although not completely missing from the documents, is the plate. So maybe when it was looted, the monastery was looted, maybe that's what went. Or maybe that's the source of a lot of this supplementary silver, I don't know. But there are no chalices, no patens. No, there's some big bowls, but those bowls are not patens, those are used for washing or washing of the hands and so forth. So there is not, was there a paten at all? I don't think so.
Yeah, only a late one, I think.
Oh, there was a paten, okay.
Yeah, the chalice and the paten, but 17th century.
Okay.
Beautiful
And there would have
wine.
been more than one in a church this size, yeah. Many more than one. So that's a minimal amount. There would have been lots and lots of plate that is now gone. So that's the diversity of the treasury, sort of the notion that the treasury did not end at all, and by any means, after its peak of the 12th and 13th century. This is very typical of treasuries. In fact, most well-stocked treasuries in important Catholic locations are dominated by 17th century material. Not so interesting to me in terms of its visual qualities, but certainly it shows the wealth of the place continuing. I want to just briefly, and I'm almost done, make an argument about the presentation of the treasury, of the status of the church that's visible already, still on the tympanum. So, of course, the artist here is realizing in stone the dramatic moment when Christ pronounces the words that are, in effect, inscribed here. Not so much in the first person, but at least this represents his speech. Then he will say to the people on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, come and possess the kingdom which has been prepared for you." Then he will say to those on his left, "Away from me, you who are under God's curse, away to the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil, and these then will be sent off to eternal punishment, and the righteous will go to eternal life." So I just read it out because we've had a lot of discussions of this, mostly by the priests in front of the tympanum. You're not having an art historian until a little later talk about this tympanum. But it has a remarkable number of inscriptions on it, and it's a very detailed tympanum, and it's specifically detailed in a ways that a lot of these Romanesque tympana, I don't think really you'd say they are. They don't have a specificity of their locale as it does here this early. Other places like Vézelay or Autun certainly have a very vivid Last Judgment at Autun, but we don't have a lot of sense that there's a development of a sense of the locale. So when we look at this, we see Christ, of course, enthroned among the stars, and I want to say there are two angels at his feet with swords protecting him from, or warding off, so to speak, the devils at the borders of hell. There's a sword and a spear. Those are not what you might think they are, because in fact, we want to look above. But first here, look at Christ a little closer, and you see that although I cannot find the wound, does anyone see it? No, it's not really there, but nonetheless his exposed side, as if to display the wound, which is interesting, because above we have, the angels descending, flying downward, holding a very, very large cross that's so dark. Maybe it's better to see in this. Can you see it with any clarity? No.
It was literally the dark one, right? It's more
The dark one is better?
Yeah.
Okay. You can look at all the inscription, it's remarkable. It's so heavily inscribed. But at any rate, they are holding the cross, but they also have a nail and the head of the lance. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Passion instruments. To me, this is an early representation of passion instruments in the north. And I can't help but think this is a reference to the treasury. We know we have a lot of relics of the True Cross, purported relics of the True Cross in the relic, both in the Pascal II reliquary, but also purportedly in the A. There's a relic of the True Cross. So this is a monastery rich with relics of the Passion in some sense. I don't know that there's any notion that there is a nail here or a lance, but we're rounding out the picture at least of that sort of passion devotion. And I just looking myself and having had a chance to read everything that you might want to read on this topic, wonder what's going on right here. And that's completely fuzzy. And when we go out there, this angel is holding a crown. This could be that he's crowning one of these figures, but these seem quite subsidiary figures. So perhaps he's joining in with his other fellows here to also bring the crown of thorns. It's hard. I don't know. It's just a suggestion, perhaps. But at any rate, I think there's much more of an emphasis here on the notion of the Passion than one would get in other contemporary Romanesque tympanum.
It's also depending a lot about when we will date the portal, because
When we date the portal.
yeah,
yes.
because if it's like
If it's
say
later.
like same period like Beaulieu, I would argue that Beaulieu is really the strongest exhibition of the Passion of the Christ. I mean, he's like really descending. You see how he suffered. But Irene told me, I didn't get the time to read it. Manuel Castañeda has recently wrote an article redating the portal of Conques at 1108, something like that.
Early beginning of the 12th century.
Yeah, so really very beginning of 12th century.
There, I know there's a lot of discussion on the dates.
If Manuel is right, because his idea, if I understand well, that there is first Santiago, and then the workshop moves to Conques to do that and conclude the Abbasian. So he's believing, Manuel, that all the church is 11th century. And then just around 1100, they just finish it with the portal. So it was made from Conques, let's say not maybe the first, but one of the, maybe the first in this kind of churches. And then the portal will be really the first one, and then I absolutely follow your ideas. It means that it's the first exhibition, and we have also really to imagine that we have those restos polychromy, but should we also imagine how they were working with those instruments of the Passion? Because it was, of course, even more visible and even closer thanks to the polychromy. So that's for me something pretty
Yeah, and actually that question about the wound, that could have been painted, I suppose, although
I'll speak a bit about it tomorrow in my lecture, but for me, Conques is the example of the kind of object and images which are conceived to what Herb Kessler recalled our spiritual seeing. I mean, the idea of spend a lot of time in front of the object, really carefully looking on each detail. It's constructed to be seen for a long time. It slows the
No,
time.
I would definitely agree, because there's so much detail on this tympanum, and you can very quickly look at Autan and enjoy the kind of, tortures that are going on one side, the blessed on the other side, but sort of take it in a more, it has a single message, whereas this has a very layered message. There's many things going on in this tympanum, and I think it's mostly been approached as a judgment of the blessed and the damned, and then, you're done. But then you miss this aspect of the Passion relics, you miss something about the patronage, you miss the details, just all these details going on all over it. It takes a really long time to look at this portal.
No, it's really, it slows your time. You are forced by the object to stay there if you want to get in contact with him. And also the anti-hierarchy. I mean, in Autan, everywhere we have a big Christ, and then something happens all around. We observed it yesterday with Irene that the Christ here is small. It's just a very small Christ in comparison of all the other tympana of the same years. And if Manuel is right, it's one of the first one, then we have a really crucial argument, because does it not work so well? I mean, with the big Christs, you understand it's a theophany. But here we are a bit lost. There is not such a big order. I mean, there is a lot of order in paradise, which is quite boring. But still, the Christ is a prominent figure, but not in such a big way.
Well, and when you speak to details too,
I would like to add that
yeah,
there are two features which are unusual. The first is narrative, many narrative things which you mentioned already. And the second, that everything is explained by inscriptions,
Yes.
Latin. And not only inscriptions which quote stories from the Bible, but also inscriptions which are just labels. For instance, lancia and clavis, the lance and the nail, are as objects explained. So as if this was so new that everything had to be described in inscription in order for people to understand, on the one hand. On the other hand, all the inscriptions are in Latin. So,
so yeah.
for pilgrims, not so
Well,
much accessible.
Last,
But really, this curiosity, the narrative element and the big inscriptions, explanatory inscriptions, point to, in my view, to the fact that there was something novel to be seen.
mm,
This was not iconography which everybody knew, but obviously you had to be introduced.
and last night we watched the priest describe it, and I think that's a very, I just want to jump right to the Middle Ages to see that, because there's all this pointing, and he could say, as it says there, which is another level of authority. Do you see what I mean? You know, so he can read the Latin, he becomes the mediator to the pilgrims, which is what you really want in a pilgrimage church. You don't want the people just ignorantly passing through without understanding. You want the church to mediate the meaning of all these objects.
For me, another crucial point really that the portal is a powerful image in the sense that I don't know any other church on the Santiago's way where priests are doing what they are doing here.
Yeah.
And I would say that partly because they are living here and so on, partly is because the portal is asking to do it. I mean, you are pushed by the portal to explain it, because today, as in the 12th century, no one does read Latin. But everybody understands that there's written some things there. We want to have the mediation.
What does it say? What does it say?
On the other hand, excuse me, on the other hand, this is like a guide, the inscriptions, and if we assume that priests were standing before the portal, reading the Latin inscriptions and speaking to the people in their language,
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
then it would function.
It's my very point. The object required
Yeah.
at that time and
And
it's
mediation.
a mediation.
But to also say, I mean, my point is that I think there are extraordinary number of objects on this portal. Not just stories or persons, but objects that are included. So, for example, we have Charlemagne, but behind him are the objects carried by the two courtiers. Sorry, let's go. And then there's the cross and the nail. But even if you go more broadly, there are the votive objects that were given to Foix, the manacles that are suspended behind her. I mean, even you go down here, this is, the blessed, and they are in the bosom of Abraham, and that's heaven in some sense. But what? There are some beautiful lamps hanging here, as if heaven needed an additional illumination. This sort of refers directly to Conques and the wealth of Conques and the objects in Conques, so that there is a sort of particularization of, especially on the blessed side, of objects. On the damn side, no, it's just massive bodies intertwining and no real objects singled out, I think. So it just supplements what we're talking about, that this is a field of objects, of space, interaction that needs to be explained, and this tympanum kind of is waiting to do that for the visitors, with the priest as an intermediary.
And if I'm not mistaken, there is a Bible quotation which says that when Christ is reappearing, his sign is carried before
Yes.
him. So this would be the perfect explanation of the big cross as a sign of the Redeemer who comes back.
It's the same as in Beaulieu, probably the later.
Well, that goes all the way back to San Sabino.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a very long-standing way of representing the sign across the cross coming down behind. But this cross strikes me as just very, also very solid, very present, very not arriving from heaven, but very much there as a solid object. I don't know, maybe that's over-interpreting it, but there is a cross,
On the other
a
hand,
nail and a spear in front of it, so.
On the other hand, Cynthia, this is the only part from which they carry it which is not divided. From the second thought on the world is twofold, is left, right.
Uh-huh.
But above there is a sphere of the
Yes.
skies of heaven.
So everything above this
There is an epiphany.
a unification, yeah.
An epiphany is something carried before Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes sense, and especially that they point out as instruments of his passion with labels. I mean, I never have noticed that even the nail and the lance are, especially in the inscription, is mentioned. So there must be an intention behind this.
And the cross is also very realistic, I would say, in
Yeah.
the sense that you're really two pieces of wood in a cross.
And it was probably painted too, so it would have even stood out more than it does today. I wonder what color, maybe golden, in effect. The colors of the painting it would be really wonderful to know. Here, of course, the sun and the moon, and the face of the sun is dark because, of course, at the crucifixion, the sun darkened, I guess, is what we have there. Do you see that? I mean, it's clear on my screen. At any rate, so this kind of representation on the front of a church is relatively unusual to reference the treasury. There are other examples. The Monza Cathedral is a wonderful example of a sort of a little inventory of the treasury right there on the facade of the church. It is, however, also set within a larger dogmatic presentation. So that would be the same kind of trend here, but there's another plaque in Venice that sort of recapitulates what's in the treasury. It's not done very commonly, but it's not unknown. So I would argue that in this case, this great tympanum that we see when we come to Conques is a sort of a trumpet call. Got the angels making the trumpet call, but a trumpet call to say, this is what you have here, this richness, not only of objects, but also of the truth of the Christian meaning, and with foi, ready to intercede for you. And we see her, of course, over on the side, making her prayers. A very, very small figure, but nonetheless very crucial within the context.
What is it what Charlemagne holds in his hands? And
He
by
seems-
whom is he introduced? He is taken by his hand,
Yes,
and he carries something in his other hand.
yes, he does.
But what is it?
Well, it looks rather like a fleur-de-lis. It has been suggested that these two figures, who each carry something, carry the two famous reliquaries that were thought at Conques to be gifts from Charlemagne, the reliquary of Pippin and the A. Although neither of those are distinctive looking like that. They are, however, carried in covered hands. So and right behind them. This may be a kind of an orb of power, or that shows he's the emperor. We also know that because he's crowned and because of his distinctive beard and mustache. But I haven't heard anybody identify specifically what he has in his hands. Does anyone know? Anyone read more widely on the temple?
No, it looked like a scepter.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, orb of power, scepter, a fleur-de-lis,
Yeah.
yeah. And who this is? I'd like to know. It's certainly the abbot, but what abbot?
Yeah, it is the abbot.
Yeah,
for sure.
it's there.
But
Yeah.
the question is which
Well,
one? We were
which abbot?
discussing it yesterday because of, well, if you accept the Manuel Castiglia's datation, so we are around 1100, it means that we have a certain famous abbot who was very active in
Yeah,
Conques
so it could be
in 1100. Bégon. The only problem is that if it's Bégon, why he is holding Charlemagne by hand, and Charlemagne is dead 200 years before.
Oh, they don't care about that, but
That's
is
but
Bégon important enough to hold Charlemagne's hand? And is he revered? Would he still be alive? You know, that would be.
Yeah, you know, for me it's a bit, let's say, heretic. On the other hand, if Bégon was this personage, which seems to be, and your arguments are going in this sense, that he was the creator of the treasure of Conques in a certain sense, and also the creator of Conques, like the Charlemagne's big donation, then it makes sense.
But what is the tradition of Charlemagne's donation in Conques?
We had
What
a whole
kind of
lecture on
tradition?
that, so this is why we are all very informed.
Oh, I see, I'm
No,
sorry.
No, it's all right, but
it's, let's say, well, they are part of truth, and there is the big old period when Charlemagne became really the star who construct Conques, and well,
That's what the relief tells us.
yeah, it's what really
But
tells.
what is the basis for this?
Well, that's it. You can
there are, modern scholars have looked through and found, trying to look historically, understand it, it really gets introduced in the life of Louis the Pious, starts to talk about the creation and reformation of a series of monasteries in this area, but that gets then shifted in the early 12th century to Charlemagne rather than Louis the Pious.
It's a much better choice than Louis the Pious.
Who cares about Louis the Pious, right? We want
Big
Charlemagne.
donor.
Yeah, right, exactly, and Charlemagne becomes the most prestigious king, the most
Yeah.
prestigious emperor, so they want to trace themselves back to them. And the interesting thing is when you go in the treasury, there's a shape that's an A shape, and the legend has it that with all of these monasteries that are founded, Conques is the first, so it gets the A. And that is actually very clearly already believed in the 12th century in Conques. And then the other secondary relic, the Pippin relic, is also thought to be, we call it Pippin today, that's not a medieval name for it. They thought that was a Charlemagne gift as well. So, and it's specified even in the Liber Miracolorum that it was carried in every procession. Anytime that Foix, the figure of Foix, left the monastery, also the Pippin, or we think also that secondary relic came with her. And also the processional cross and some other things probably too, but you know, that was an automatic part of the procession, even a small procession. So I wish we could see these better or what they are, but possibly they are those two famous reliquaries even.
Just about the gesture itself, like the Charlemagne is lifted by a hand.
Yeah, he's taken by the hand.
Yeah, and is it something which we can see often?
If we can see.
Often, like this?
Well,
this
actually,
kind of-
yes. I mean, I think that if you look at images of kings and saints, even saintly kings, it's funny. Edward the Confessor, for example, his iconography, he's recommended by a saint to Christ. He's not himself, even though he's a saint, able to sort of be a mediator. So king saints even are put in a lesser position. So although it seems odd to have, Charlemagne
And Charlemagne,
taken by the hand, that is an appropriate sort of ecclesiastical position, I
and his
think.
body position is also like really.
Yeah, he's smaller. He's visibly
Yeah,
smaller.
yeah.
But it's the reason why I don't convince me just in a certain way, because imagine that he would be so proud about himself, that represent himself bigger than Charlemagne, introduce him to God.
Yes, but such representation is possible and maybe necessary because this claim has been questioned. So it is argued now we have this tradition. And there was something or somebody who questioned this tradition.
That's the answer.
And this is the answer. You go and look and you see
Oh, there was
above
somebody.
the portal that it is true.
You're right, and there was somebody in Figeac, another monastery that they had an active dispute in front of the papal court with. And Figeac was trying to depose the abbot of Conques and take over the control.
Yeah.
So you're right. So, that
So
I mean,
there is this-
people have not, I don't think, said that this is Begon. Maybe
And
they
there is
have.
this
I
famous-
have not read all the literature, but it seems a perfect representation of.
And
that-
there is this famous chronicler from Venice in the 13th century who reports the legend of St. Mark. And then he adds, if you don't believe me, go in front of St. Mark's church and see it depicted. It's a proof.
And yes, visual
Martino de
imagery is
Canal
certainly used.
Was it Martino de Canal?
Uh-huh. Visual imagery is used as proof. There's one example in hagiographic canonization procedures where a deputation from the Pope comes to look at Lorenzetti frescoes in Italy, paintings that are now lost of a saint by Lorenzetti to use as documents of canonization. Yeah, so it's clear that images could function in that way in the Middle Ages, and so, yeah, I think that's a very good proposal. Here we are. Figeac, what do you think? No, we have the rights, because Charlemagne gave them to us. Oh, in fact, this might represent, because he actually gave privileges.
Yeah.
So in some sense, this may represent this object. Could be in the sense of objects representing legal agreements in this era. This could represent the legal agreement of the privileges that he gave to Conques. And then these are secondary real developers.
But this is a point which is just a visual connection. Probably it's completely absurd, but he said in something on the top of this thing there is the fleur of lis form,
Yeah, here.
which we know is from the crown of Saint Foy.
Exactly, so yeah, it's not.
The original reconstruction proposed by Tahanon, there was already a fleur de lis. I don't know if Tahanon is right, but still, it reminds me a lot of this object. If this object was on top of the crown, we could even imagine that it was considered as a donation of Charlemagne, who did the crown, who gave the crown to Saint Foy.
And Charlemagne is not entering paradise because he was great, but because he was a donor.
You bet. That's the best way for rich people to get into heaven. Give it all away.
There is a question of Pavla.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if it has to be a problem to have a Begon and Charlemagne at the same picture because we are
Yes.
in the end of the time, we are in eternity and it's last judgment. So is it a problem to have them together in one picture in the age without ages?
It's not labeled, and when you think of Sujet, and he had no shame, he was labeled everywhere, right? Little prayer, pray for me, Sujet, at every moment. Maybe it is Begon as the abbot, so to speak, in the personification of the abbot, so that he's every abbot of Conques, but in addition himself, in some sense, to get over that problem of he's not dead yet, he's not at the Last Judgment, or maybe it's a projection forward to when the Last Judgment occurs, and so he doesn't have to be dead.
Some sort of time.
It's the end of time,
And it's not impossible that they owned a statue of Charlemagne at the time in Conques.
Yeah.
Because if you go to Münster, the statue looks like this, and it's also the donor.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, it's not.
He's also a donor at
impossible.
Munster? That's why he's there at Munster, because he's a donor. Yeah.
Right. There is a question of Sabina.
Yeah, I just realized I was always all the time asking myself why the Saint Foy is so small on the tympanon. If is she the star there, and now this understanding the portal as the defending the position against the Figeac makes sense also in this context. So there's a reason because the Foy wasn't so important in that let's say dispute. So there's the reason why she isn't there so magnificent or something like that, and why the rest of the treasury, which is connecting the present Conques with the Charlemagne and so on, it's much more visible there. It's just my remark.
Well, we can't help but be stunned by her, I think, and but that's our relationship to her, and we shouldn't then therefore ignore the larger context. I think in the medieval period, any proper churchman is never going to think of Foy as one and only in any situation. That would be casting her as an idol, casting her as most important, and no virgin martyr, although she's essential, is the most important. Really, the most important is the whole picture, That's what we see here. Where's my picture? The whole picture is what's most important. So it's contextual.
There is also the question, of the revelation. If I understand well, and I think through our partial experience of the walk, one of the important stuff of pilgrimage churches is veiling and revealing. So if you have a first connection with Saint Foy, a small Saint Foy, maybe she was already golden, small, not really at the center, but still back. And then you enter, and you are following the pilgrims, and then you have the epiphany of the person. So it's even more powerful, because you know, of course, that Saint Foy is here, at least since the period you are hearing about her miracles, you are walking in the region. All the stories of Bernard d'Angers are just a small part, tiny part of what was always repeated about her. And then you arrive in Conques, you don't see the church first because you are in the valley, and then you enter, and then you enter, and then. So all those steps are pushing you to have really the most initiation to get in an iconic presence.
But on the other hand, even as you suggested last night, you might have come in on the second story, you wouldn't necessarily come this way. I think that also you're trying to, the time it takes to understand this temple, it is not, boom, your initial impression or learning from it. It's coming back and coming back again,
Or
and staying for a whole day and going through all the,
My impression is that this kind of classical liminal zone. The tympano in alone is the place you have to stay and spend time before you can enter. And since Ziegler told this a very interesting thing, the church is too small to all the monks and all the corners. So when you enter the church and there is a prayer, you cannot enter. The church is too small. I mean, it will be probably a sort of opening, closing of the doors, which are activated, as we know, only when they're closed. So there is all the game of entering and not entering.
Yeah, right.
Because
the notion of the population of Conques is very important to keep remembering, because it was much, much bigger in the Middle Ages than it is today, which is so opposite to our usual experience.
So I could imagine people
thousands
can
like
stay
this.
outside. They can stay outside for a couple of time. You arrive when is the prayer. Sorry, you have to wait 1 hour. There is liturgy. You have to wait 2 hours. And why are you waiting in front of the portal?
But maybe in this time the tribunes were used. The tribunes,
Of course, but you don't see from the tribunes.
Okay.
There is a very bad, you will not met Saint Foy from the tribunes. You can go there, have a rest, but if you will enter the church, then you have to go through the main portal when it's a
So the stairs on either side are modern? The ones that go up to the tribune? So there were no original stairs?
only one really small stairs inside.
Okay.
And so it's why
That's one of the
decided
reasons
yesterday
they
the
were
bridge.
Uh-huh.
So, not.
Do you have any other comments? I think otherwise we are done for right now.
So, just for the program for this afternoon. If someone is following us, I have to repeat it to the camera since you are changing a bit the program. Okay, so to the afternoon we have a small change. We'll have lunch now, and after the lunch we will get, not immediately, but after a bit of time, the discussion about the article which we read about female pilgrimage and, let's say, anthropology. And then at 3:30 we will have the iconic presence lecture of Hans. So if someone is following us through internet, you will be online at 3:30 p.m. And for us, the meeting is after lunch. We'll get a small break because I have to speak with a journalist, but immediately after that we'll do a discussion. So, thank you very much. Thank you, Cynthia, a lot, and thank you for all the participants. Thank you.